This image is from 1945 and it shows a physicist called 𝐒𝐲𝐚𝐥. You might have thought that he is carrying some beers or maybe milk, like I thought he was a milkman. But he is holding the core of the Nagasaki Fat Man bomb, the bomb that was detonated over the city of Nagasaki, and it's responsible for over 80,000 deaths. And when the bombing in Hiroshima happened, he even flew in a plane to record the whole thing. Like, this guy creeps me out. Eileen Wuornos, a serial killer that had killed 7 men that she picked up. When she was only 13 years old, her father committed suicide, her mother left her to her grandparents, her grandmother died the same year, and her grandfather raped her. At the age of 33, she began the killings with her lover and partner in crime, Tyria Moore. But when Moore left her, she was arrested and worked with the police to get a confession out of Wuornos. And she succeeded, but Wuornos said that she killed only in self-defense. She was later sentenced to death, and her last words were, "I just like to say that I'm sailing with the rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6, like the movie, Big Mothership and all. I'll be back." Yeah. John List committed almost the perfect murder, and he and his family were the embodiment of the American dream, and that was until he lost his job, and things got much worse. He couldn't tell his family that he lost his job, so he pretended to go to work. At least he did, until he decided that the only option was to kill the entire family. He had planned everything. He shot his wife, children, and mother one by one, and then he put them into sleeping bags and left a note to his pastor. He claimed that this was the only way to ensure their safe arrival in heaven. And then he left, and he wasn't seen for 18 years until he was finally arrested. In 1984, Joseph called his daughter Elizabeth into the basement of his home because he wanted some help refitting the door into the renovated cellar. As soon as they fixed it, he knocked her unconscious, and she remained there for the next 24 years. Her father came up with stories of her running away from the family, and 2 years later he started raping her, and she had 7 children. One of them died, 3 of them remained in the basement, and the other 3 went upstairs and lived with Joseph. But his crimes were uncovered when the oldest child in the cellar fell ill. So she went to the hospital and the investigation reopened. A bit later, Joseph at last released his daughter, who had reached the age of 42, and he was arrested. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old student that disappeared in 2013 at the hotel. There's even a viral video of her in an elevator before her disappearance. In the video, it seemed like she was talking to someone and she was acting strangely. She jumped in and out of the elevator and then vanished. Not like literally vanished, like poof, I mean she disappeared, like was missing. Her body was found in a water tank on the hotel's roof 19 days later. Her death was strange because there was no signs of trauma, so she wasn't murdered probably, and there was no alcohol or drugs in her body. So her death was officially documented as accidental, and there are so many people that believe that it was something supernatural. In 2004, Natsumi Tsuji, 11 years old, invited her close friend into an empty classroom at lunchtime. She wanted to show her a new game. She sat her on a chair, took off her glasses, and told her that she was going to die. Of course, her friend didn't run away because it was just a game, right? Natsumi then covered her friend's eyes with her hand and plunged a box cutter in the middle of her friend's neck. She had no voice to call for help, and then Natsumi also slashed both of her friend's wrists. And then she calmly left the classroom covered in blood. Like something usual. All that because her friend called her fat and didn't apologize. She then went to a teacher and said, "I have done something wrong," while crying. John Gacy was part of a clown club, and he was performing at birthday parties and hospitals as Pogo the Clown. He committed his first murder on accident, but he later said that it gave him the ultimate thrill, which he craved for the rest of his life. All of his victims were young men and boys that he would lure into his house, torture them, rape them, kill them, and store them under his house. He killed 33 men before at least being suspected of being a serial killer, and then he was arrested. He was sentenced to death and his last words were "kiss my ass." Really poetic. This is Tamara Samsonova, 68 years old and also known as the Granny Reaper. She was arrested for the murder of a 79-year-old lady who was her friend. She had dismembered her body and dumped it behind her apartment, and all that because of an argument about unwashed cups. Yeah. But after the arrest, she admitted to have killed 13 people, and the investigators believed that that number could be up to 21. It was later discovered that she also partook in cannibalism. She liked to remove the lungs of her victims and eat them. She was determined to be incompetent for trial and she was sent to a mental hospital. That's it. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was a serial killer known as the Grim Sleeper. That sounds scary. He was described as friendly and quiet by his neighbors, but inside his house there were photos of the woman he had brutalized and murdered. After 25 years, he was found and arrested, like a quarter of a century later. When the police searched his house, they found almost 1,000 photos of women who were apparently his victims. In 2016, he was sentenced to death, but last year, he mysteriously died in his cell, with no signs of trauma and taking his true number of victims to the grave. So when Didi's daughter Gypsy was born, she started claiming that her daughter had all kinds of medical problems. Gypsy was taking tons of medications and she went through multiple surgeries, but she was actually perfectly healthy except for some problems that the medications caused. Apparently, Didi had a syndrome which caused her to fabricate her daughter's ill health to get attention and sympathy. She even shaved her daughter's hair off to appear ill. When her daughter got older, she joined a Christian dating site, where she met a guy and convinced him to kill her mother and run away together. And he did exactly that, and Gypsy posted on Facebook that her mother was dead. So she was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. So when Daniel Villegas was 16 years old, he and 3 other teenagers were walking home from a party. But suddenly a car stopped and started shooting the group. Daniel and 1 other teen started running and they were saved, but the other teens were shot dead. But police didn't find any evidence that could help them identify the murderer. So, to solve the case, the police put Daniel through a 5-hour manipulative interrogation where he was threatened with beatings, sexual assault, and death sentence. So he signed the confession that was typed out by the detectives and he was sentenced to life in prison. But after 18 years fighting for his freedom, he actually managed to get it. But we still don't know who the murderer was. So 19-year-old Kenneka was found frozen to death in a hotel's freezer. She spent the evening at a friend's birthday party and the night at the hotel, and that night she went missing. And 24 hours after her disappearance, she was found dead in the hotel's freezer. But the weird part is that there were no answers about how she ended up in there, even though there was an emergency latch in case someone was stuck inside. She could have fallen victim to someone at the hotel, but her death was documented as accidental. And that's because of the alcohol and anti-seizure medicine that was found in her system. But there are many theories about what could have happened, and many of those are pretty weird. So the 40-year-old Tamla Horsford went to a friend's sleepover party, but she never made it back home. She was found dead the next morning. The other attendees claimed that she died after a fall while she was drunk, and the injuries were consistent with a fall. But the question is, how did she went unnoticed until the next morning? And the attorney of her family claimed that Horsford appeared to have been involved in a struggle before her death. So like her husband said, none of the stories make sense so far, and when that happens, usually there is a reason. Junko Furuta was a 16-year-old Japanese girl who underwent 44 days of hell before dying at the hands of 4 teenage boys. She was kidnapped by those 4 boys and she was taken to a home of one of those boys' parents. Even when the boys' parents found out that she was held captive, they did nothing because one of the boys had connections with the Yakuza. Junko went through a lot. She was repeatedly tortured, beaten, and raped for 44 days. The torturing part was really disturbing. The whole thing was disturbing, but she was begging them to just kill her. I cannot even mention the things she went through, but if you want to, you can read it online, but I've warned you. And the sentences that the boys got was nothing compared to what they did. By now, each one of them is already out of jail. So Gein grew up in a house dominated by a controlling mother, but when she died, his mental health disintegrated. After some years, a woman was reported missing from her hardware store, and the trail of blood led to Gein's home. And there they found her headless, gutted body hanging from the ceiling. They also found human organs in jars and skulls used as bowls. He confessed to killing 2 people and to digging up graves and practicing necrophilia. Yeah, he also made masks and suits out of their skin. And the character Leatherface was inspired by Gein. So Joe Metheny was on a quest to find his runaway wife. Driven by revenge, he raped, murdered and dismembered homeless people and prostitutes while on his way to find his wife. But the way he disposed the bodies was truly horrific. Instead of hiding them, he was bringing them back home. Then he would chop them, mix them with pork and turn them into little burgers. He then opened up a barbecue stand and served those burgers to his customers. And no one ever noticed. Brian Pata pulled it to his parking lot in 2006 and he was approached by a man who shot him in the head. Police found out that he had ongoing issues with a teammate called Jones. Jones even threatened Brian to shoot him in the head. He was interviewed twice, but he told the police that he was at home during the night of the murder. But nearly 15 years later, they discovered that he was at the crime scene at the time of the murder.